welcome back. In the previous episode, I began with a simple but uncomfortable claim. The best project does not always win. And the point there was not to dismiss portfolio management, but to take it seriously enough to describe it honestly. Because portfolios are not built only out of rational choices and clean comparisons. They are shaped by sponsorship, visibility, timing, narrative strength, and organizational interpretation. In this episode, I want to take that realism one step further. I want to talk about something that exists in many organizations, but is rarely described clearly in formal governance language. And that is the difference between the portfolio you say you have and the portfolio you actually run. Most organizations have an official portfolio. It may be called an IT portfolio, a digitalization portfolio, a change portfolio, an investment portfolio, a strategic project portfolio, or something similar. It usually has a recognizable form. There is a list of initiatives, a governance structure, a review cycle, some kind of prioritization logic, a capacity view, a risk summary, and perhaps a set of strategic themes or categories. This is the portfolio that gets presented in steering groups, portfolio boards, PMO reporting, executive updates, and annual planning discussions. It is the visible portfolio. It is the legitimate portfolio. It is the one the organization can point to and say, this is what we are doing. But in many cases, that is only part of the truth. Because alongside that official portfolio sits another one. It may not have a name. It may not have owners in the same formal sense. It may not go through the same quality of review. It may not appear clearly in the same reporting structures. But it is very real. It consumes people, time, money, attention, managerial energy, technical expertise, and delivery capacity. This is what I would call the shadow portfolio. The shadow portfolio is made up of work that is real, necessary, and often urgent, but insufficiently represented in the official portfolio view. It includes things like incident recovery, urgent compliance changes, vendor-driven adjustments, security responses, integration fixes, technical remediation, environment failures, audit responses, regulatory deadlines, emergency data corrections, local requests from powerful stakeholders, politically urgent one-offs, and all the strange, messy, hidden work that appears when a complex organization tries to keep itself functioning while also trying to transform. And once you start looking for this shadow portfolio, you begin to realize how much of organizational reality it may contain. One of the reasons this matters so much is that the official portfolio often presents itself as if it were the main object of resource consumption. It implies that if we understand this list of initiatives, we understand where our capacity is going. But in practice, many organizations are not mainly constrained by the formal projects they approved. They are constrained by the interaction between those approved initiatives and a large volume of semi-visible or poorly governed work that keeps interrupting, fragmenting, and redirecting people. This is especially common in IT-heavy environments, public organizations, universities, regulated sectors, and any setting with legacy systems, complex dependencies, and limited slack. The formal portfolio may say that the organization is working on 10 strategic initiatives, but the lived reality may be that key people are repeatedly pulled into production issues, vendor escalations, compliance tasks, infrastructure instability, security updates, broken integrations, reporting demands, procurement-related adjustments, and a constant stream of things that were not prominent enough to become portfolio items, but important enough that they cannot be ignored. And this is where the official picture becomes misleading. Not because it is false in a narrow sense, but because it is incomplete in a structurally important way. Let us consider a familiar scene. A portfolio board meets and reviews progress across a set of digital initiatives. The slides are well prepared. There is a capacity view. Projects are marked as green, amber, or red. A few dependency issues are noted. Some resource constraints are mentioned. The overall impression is one of controlled movement. There may be pressure, yes, but it is pressure within a governable frame. The portfolio exists as an object that can be overseen. Now imagine the lived week of the people doing the work beneath that presentation. A systems specialist loses 2 days to an urgent vendor issue. A security lead is pulled into a response to a newly identified vulnerability. A business analyst is redirected to support an unplanned audit request. An integration developer is asked to solve a problem that is blocking a local service area and cannot wait for the next quarterly planning cycle. A manager spends half a day preparing briefing material for an issue that emerged politically rather than operationally. An architect who was supposed to support a strategic initiative ends up spending the afternoon in a meeting about data inconsistencies in an older system that nobody had wanted to reopen. None of this looks dramatic from a distance, but together, this kind of work changes the actual portfolio that is being run. And that is the key point. The real portfolio is not only the set of things the organization has approved, it is the set of things the organization is actually spending scarce capability on. This may sound obvious, but organizations often fail to govern accordingly. They continue to discuss delivery problems as if the main issue were project execution quality, when part of the issue may be that the official portfolio is resting on a fantasy of available capacity. In other words, the problem is not always that teams are underperforming. Sometimes the problem is that governance is only seeing the visible commitments and not the hidden burden underneath them. This is one reason why so many portfolio conversations about prioritization feel frustrating in practice. A new initiative is assessed carefully. It is scored. It is debated. It is perhaps approved. But the approval is made against a capacity picture that is often far more stable and orderly than the one delivery staff actually inhabit. The organization thinks it has made a choice among projects. In reality, it has made that choice without fully reckoning with the background load of all the things that will continue to consume the same people. So the shadow portfolio is not only about hidden work, it is also about hidden competition. Work is competing for the same finite attention, even when only some of that work is allowed to appear as strategic. And once we see that, another uncomfortable question emerges. Why is so much of this work hidden in the first place? Part of the answer is that organizations need simplification to function. No executive team can govern everything at full resolution. No portfolio board can hold the full texture of lived operational reality in every meeting. So of course there will always be compression. There will always be some degree of abstraction. That in itself is not a failure. It is necessary. But simplification becomes dangerous when it turns into your selective invisibility. When certain categories of work repeatedly disappear from strategic view, the organization may begin to build plans on top of assumptions that are not merely incomplete, but systematically optimistic. It starts to imagine that strategic work sits on top of a reasonably stable platform of delivery capacity, when in fact that capacity is continuously eroded, interrupted, and redirected by a large body of essential but underrepresented work. This has consequences. It affects forecasting. It affects sequencing. It affects morale. It affects trust in governance. It affects how people interpret executive ambition. It affects whether a portfolio is experienced as credible or performative. Because from the point of view of delivery teams, there is often a huge difference between being asked to deliver a demanding but coherent set of priorities and being asked to deliver an official portfolio while quietly absorbing an unacknowledged second one. In the first case, pressure may still be high, but the structure of expectation is at least more honest. In the second case, teams are often judged against a formal commitment set that never really matched the lived demand profile to begin with. This is where the language of resource constraints can sometimes become too weak. Resource constraints sound neutral, almost technical, but what many organizations are really facing is a deeper representational problem. They do not only have too little capacity, they have too little visibility into what their capacity is already being spent on. And because that visibility is weak, they keep making decisions that reproduce the mismatch. Let me make this concrete with an example. Imagine a university or a public agency with a formal digital portfolio. There are projects around service improvement, integration, reporting capability, student or citizen-facing systems, data quality, and process automation. On paper, the portfolio looks ambitious but manageable. Now layer onto that the actual operational environment. Legacy systems generate recurring incidents. Security requirements shift. National or institutional compliance needs change. Vendors release updates with downstream implications. External stakeholders ask for fast responses. Older interfaces break. Data inconsistencies require manual correction. There are procurement-related delays and workarounds. A local unit escalates an issue because a service outage or administrative bottleneck has become visible enough that it can no longer wait. What happens then? The official portfolio is not replaced, it remains in place, but it is no longer the only meaningful frame for action. Instead, the organization starts living in dual mode. It talks in one language of strategy and portfolio governance, while operating in another language of interruption, rescue, adaptation, and hidden reprioritization. The result is often not one portfolio failing. It is two portfolios colliding. Now, it is worth being careful here. The shadow portfolio is not simply bad work. Much of it is legitimate. Some of it is essential. In fact, some of the most responsible work an organization does may live there. If a critical vulnerability is discovered, it should interrupt other plans. If a compliance risk emerges, it may need immediate response. If an integration failure threatens core operations, then someone has to stop what they were doing and address it. The problem is not that unplanned work exists. The problem is that many organizations rely on it being absorbed quietly while continuing to talk, as though the official portfolio remains the primary reality. And when that happens, two kinds of distortion emerge. The first is strategic distortion. Leadership may believe it is steering the organization through the official portfolio, while much of the actual movement is being shaped by what the formal picture does not adequately capture. The second is evaluative distortion. And teams and projects may be judged as though they were working under clean portfolio conditions, when in fact they are operating in a much noisier and more fragmented environment. This can create a particularly corrosive experience for middle managers, PMOs, architects, technical leads, and delivery teams. They are often close enough to reality to see the hidden load, but not always powerful enough to change the formal representation of that reality. So they end up translating constantly between two worlds. Upwards, they report in the language of portfolio governance. Downwards and sideways, they manage in the language of disruption, dependency, and improvisation. Over time, That can create fatigue not only because the workload is high, but because the representational burden is high. People are not only doing the work, they are also constantly reconciling two different versions of what the work is. There is also a political dimension here. Some work enters the official portfolio because it is visible, fundable, and strategically legible. Other work remains in the shadows because it is awkward, fragmented, cross-cutting, or difficult to narrate. Incident-driven work, technical remediation, small but necessary fixes, ugly dependencies, and accumulated maintenance do not always have the right shape to become attractive portfolio objects. They are too distributed, too operational, too reactive, too embarrassing, too old, too hard to package as progress. So they stay semi-visible, yet they continue to consume real capability. And once again, visibility matters. Work that stays in the shadows is easier to underappreciate, under-resource, and repeatedly postpone. But because it does not disappear, it returns later as disruption. This is one reason why organizations can feel surprised by pressures that, in a deeper sense, were never surprising at all. They were simply underrepresented. There is an important portfolio lesson in that. What governance does not represent well, it cannot steer well. So, what can organizations do? The first step is conceptual. They need to stop treating the official portfolio as the whole of managed demand. It is not. At best, it is a highly important subset. And that means the capacity discussion must become more honest. Instead of asking only how many projects can fit into the portfolio, organizations need to ask what share of key capability is continuously consumed by non-portfolio or semi-portfolio work, not occasionally, but structurally, not as an exception, but as a recurring feature of the environment. The second step is to build better categories. If all meaningful work has to appear either as a formal strategic initiative or as an invisible background burden, governance becomes too crude. Many organizations would benefit from explicitly distinguishing between at least a few types of demand: strategic change, mandatory compliance or policy response, technical risk reduction, operationally urgent intervention, and foundational maintenance or platform health. These categories will still overlap, and they will not solve everything, but they can make the portfolio conversation more realistic. They can help leaders see that different kinds of work place different claims on attention and cannot always be evaluated as though they were interchangeable. The third step is to develop better ways of describing interruption and fragmentation. Many portfolio models are still too oriented toward approved projects and too weak at representing context switching, hidden dependency work, and interruption overhead. A person may nominally be assigned to a strategic initiative, but in practice lose large amounts of cognitive and scheduling capacity to unplanned tasks. If governance only sees headcount allocation percentages, it may miss the lived fragmentation that makes execution harder. In that sense, capacity is not only about how many people are assigned, it is about how governable their attention actually is. This also means that portfolio maturity is not only about prioritizing the right projects, it is about protecting focus where focus is necessary and acknowledging disruption where disruption is unavoidable. Those are different tasks. Some organizations are reasonably good at the first and very weak at the second. There is another implication here for leadership communication. Leaders often speak in terms of priority, and understandably so. Prioritization is one of the central acts of governance. But when people in the organization hear 5 or 6 things described as top priority while still carrying a hidden load of operational and reactive work, the word priority begins to weaken. It starts to lose credibility. People do not only ask what the top priority is, they quietly ask, compared to what? Protected by what? At the expense of what? If the portfolio does not answer those questions honestly, then strategic language may begin to feel detached from lived experience. This is why shadow portfolios are not a niche concern. They are central to whether portfolio governance is trusted. If the official picture repeatedly fails to reflect the real demand environment, people will still attend the meetings, fill in the templates, and update the dashboards. But the deeper belief that the portfolio is the place where reality is acknowledged may begin to erode. And that is dangerous, because once that trust goes, portfolio management becomes easier to perform than to believe in. To avoid that, organizations need more than better project reporting. They need a more truthful account of demand. They need to ask not only what initiatives are approved, but what work is repeatedly arriving outside the approved frame. They need to understand which parts of the organization absorb invisible burdens and which parts are more protected from them. They need to see where technical fragility, regulatory exposure, vendor dependence, or operational complexity are generating recurring shadow work. And they need to accept that in many IT environments, the portfolio is never just a set of chosen bets. It is also a living response to the friction of the current system landscape. And there is a useful shift in thinking here. Instead of seeing shadow work mainly as noise around the portfolio, we can see it as data about the system. If the same kinds of interruptions keep happening, that tells us something. It may tell us that architecture is weak, that operational risk is underfunded, that compliance work is being treated too reactively, that vendor dependencies are poorly governed, or that the boundary between projects and operations is badly designed. In other words, the shadow portfolio is not only an execution problem, it is also a diagnostic signal. That means mature organizations should not only try to suppress or hide this work better. They should learn from it. They should ask what recurring shadow work reveals about deeper structural conditions. Why do the same people keep getting pulled off strategic initiatives? Why do similar urgent issues keep emerging? Which kinds of non-portfolio work are actually predictable enough that they should no longer be treated as surprises? What would happen if those patterns were represented explicitly in capacity and investment logic rather than absorbed through goodwill and improvisation? These are not easy questions, but they are essential if portfolio management is going to mean more than maintaining a formal list of intentions. But let me come back to the core argument. The portfolio you say you have is the one that appears in official governance. The portfolio you actually run is the one that includes all the work your scarce capability is truly being spent on. In many organizations, the gap between those two portfolios is one of the biggest reasons strategic delivery feels slower, harder, and less coherent than leadership expects. And if that gap remains hidden, organizations may keep responding in the wrong way. They may ask for better discipline when the problem is representational blindness. They may ask for better delivery when the problem is chronic fragmentation. They may ask for more accurate forecasting when the demand picture itself is underdescribed. They may ask project teams to perform miracles inside a system that has not admitted the weight of its own shadow work. That is why this issue matters so much. A portfolio is not only a plan, it is also a claim about reality. And when that claim becomes too selective, the consequences show up everywhere. In overloaded teams, in slipping schedules, in weak trust, in strategic frustration, and in the quiet growth of organizational cynicism. So what would a more honest portfolio look like? Not one that tries to represent every detail of operational life, because that would become unmanageable, but one that is explicit about categories of demand, realistic about interruption, conscious of hidden capacity drain, and willing to discuss recurring shadow work as a structural management issue rather than a background inconvenience. A more honest portfolio is not necessarily a more complicated one, it is a more self-aware one. And that self-awareness matters because organizations do not become more strategic by talking only about strategy. They become more strategic when their representation of demand is close enough to reality that choices can actually hold. Thank you for listening. In the next episode, I want to explore what happens when projects do not really die. When weak initiatives stay alive because stopping them is politically awkward, emotionally costly, or institutionally difficult. In other words, I want to talk about zombie projects and something I think more organizations should name clearly: portfolio debt. And before we close, let me leave you with one question for your own organization. If you listed not only your approved initiatives, but also the work that repeatedly interrupts, redirects, and quietly consumes your most important people, how different would your real portfolio look from the one in your slides?